Hi, welcome to Canterbury Cottage. I'm Sherry. If you'd like to make some updates to your kitchen but don't have money to spend, then this video is for you. Today I'll be turning a small basement room into a kitchenette for my son. And even though the room was in really rough shape, I challenged myself to transform it for under $100. And let me tell you, $100 does not go very far today. So I had to be really creative. I can't wait to show you what I came up with. So let's get started. In previous videos, I made over the family room and bedroom in this basement. I'll be sure to link those videos in the description box in case you haven't seen them. When I first toured this basement, this small room off of the family room was being used for storage. Once I cleared it out, this is what I found. Fake paneling and a bunch of cable cords on the right-hand wall. Real wood paneling along the back wall with some built-in bookshelves that were missing some of the trim. On the left-hand side was a large cabinet with orange burlap covered doors and a yellow laminate countertop. Above that were some built-in cabinets, again missing some of the trim. To the left of the family room door was an unfinished wall of sheetrock that had suffered some water damage. My least favorite thing about this room were the sagging acoustical ceiling tiles. I removed a couple of the tiles and saw that the wood underneath was quite pretty. So I grabbed a couple large garbage sacks and began tearing them down. They were quite old, and so I was able to pull them down just using my hands. The ceiling tiles had been stapled into long 1x4s that were nailed into the floor joists. I also decided to remove the 1x4s, and luckily I was able to easily pry them loose using a small crowbar. I then used the claw end of the crowbar to pry out the nails that had been holding the 1x4s into the joists. It cost me absolutely nothing to remove all of those acoustic tiles, and it probably only took me about an hour to remove the tiles, the boards, and the nails, and it made a tremendous difference. There were a few old phone cords and coaxial cables that were running through the ceiling and down the walls. I removed the telephone wire, and the cable company came and removed 4 unnecessary coaxial cables, one that had been run through a huge hole in the wall, which I was able to repair with several coats of spackle. Once all the ceiling tiles were removed, I realized that the walls just ended at the ceiling line, both along the paneled walls and the sheetrocked walls. But luckily, I had a pile of 1x4s that I had just removed from the ceiling that I could use for crown molding. First, I just needed to remove all the nails and staples. I measured each wall segment and then cut the boards on my miter saw. Then I installed them along the ceiling line using my nail gun. Using the 1x4s along the ceiling line also conveniently covered up the gap at the top of the built-in cabinets. Discovering all those free boards underneath the ceiling tiles was such a gift because that wood trim really finished off the room and gave it a much cleaner look. It even made the ductwork look a little nicer. In case you hadn't noticed, so far I haven't spent 1 cent on this makeover. So I decided to keep the trend going and only use paint that I already had in my stash. Wood stain often bleeds through paint, causing discoloration. So it was necessary for me to go over the paneling with some Zinsser shellac primer. I always keep shellac primer on hand to deal with dark stained wood. Once the primer was dry, I painted over it using the Aqua Springs paint that I had left over from the family room and bedroom makeovers. As I mentioned before, a couple of the walls had been covered in unfinished sheetrock, so I still needed to go over the seams. So my first purchase for this kitchen makeover was a roll of drywall joint tape and a tub of spackle. For the smoothest finish, you need to apply 3 thin coats of spackle, sanding in between each coat. The basement had suffered some water damage when the sump pump malfunctioned, and I needed to deal with the mold that had started to grow on the drywall. So before painting these walls, I applied Zinsser mold-killing primer to the affected areas. Some of the paneling was buckled due to water damage, and so I used a level to mark a line just above the water damage, and then I used my oscillating tool to cut off that bottom damaged section of paneling. Oscillating tools are perfect for making cuts in locations where saws won't fit. Then I used my nail gun to reattach the paneling to the studs. I'll cover this hole with some trim wood later on. Some of the built-in cabinetry had been trimmed out and some of it had not, almost as if they had run out of trim and just didn't bother to buy any more. So I measured the existing trim and then went to the lumber yard and bought a piece of trim to match. I cut the trim to fit along the front and sides of the shelves and then nailed it in place. Adding a piece of trim along the front of a shelf makes a thin piece of wood look like a thick, expensive piece of wood. I wanted this room to have a personality of its own, and so even though I had painted much of the woodwork in the basement black, I decided to use green in the kitchen. Besides, I was almost out of black paint, and another can of paint was not in my budget. But I had a can of green paint left from a bookcase that I painted in a previous video. At some point, a partition wall had been added between the cabinets and the garage door, and you could see the wall through the end of the cabinets. Luckily, I had a piece of hardboard left from when I closed off the pass-through window in the bedroom, and I cut it to fit the end of the cabinets. I just traced around it and cut it out with my jigsaw. Once it was cut out, I put it back and nailed it in place, and then painted it with the same green paint. The lower cabinets were covered with some groovy orange burlap and rope. When I tried to remove the framing from the back of the doors, the wood started to split. So I was going to have to cut it out or keep it, and I wasn't going to keep it. I cut along the edges with a utility knife and then just pulled and ripped it out as best I could. I had to use some needle nose pliers to get out some small pieces. I painted the door trim with the same green paint that I had used on the upper cabinets. Then I found some peel and stick wallpaper that I had left over from a different project, and I cut and applied it to the door panels where the orange burlap had been. I started with this black and white graphic wallpaper, but when I accidentally ripped a piece, I didn't end up having enough. I had wanted to use it in the upper cabinets too. And so ultimately I used a different peel and stick wallpaper that you'll see later in the video. I applied some caulk to clean up the inner edges of the panel and to help secure the wallpaper in place. Then I drilled an additional hole in the door frame so that I could replace the original knobs with some gold handles that I found in my stash that look very similar to the gold handles that I used on the cabinets in the bedroom makeover. Now that the cabinets were looking better, I needed to deal with that yellow laminate countertop. And the easiest fix that I have found is to cover it with contact paper. I once put contact paper on the counter that surrounded a laundry room sink, and it lasted for years with no issues at all. I'm not saying that it's going to last forever because it won't, but it only cost a few dollars, and it will last a few years if you take your time applying it, and in a couple years you can pull it up and replace it with some fresh contact paper. I debated whether I should put a small table in this kitchen or not. Then I came up with an idea that wouldn't crowd this small space, and it was free. I had taken down some oak hanging shelves when I did the bedroom makeover and thought that one of them would make a nice bar top along the paneled wall. I cut it to the length that I wanted, and then I cut off about 12 inches of the front trim on one end so that it would fit over the built-in bookshelves. Using some shelf brackets from my stash, I attached one in the center and one at the far right end of the shelf, making sure that I screwed into studs for a secure hold. Now that the painting and construction work was done, I was ready to deal with the concrete floors. About a year ago, sheet vinyl was installed in the upstairs kitchen, and there were several large scrap pieces in the garage. So I decided to patch them together to cover the floor in this small room. I laid out my first piece and lined it up exactly where I wanted. Then I folded one half of the piece back, and then I rolled on my vinyl adhesive in that area and used a small sponge brush to get right up to the edges. I waited about 30 minutes for the adhesive to get tacky. It turns clear as it dries. Once it turned completely clear, I carefully rolled the vinyl back into place, and then I began rubbing over the vinyl to adhere it firmly to the floor. I put a fresh blade in my utility knife and trimmed off the edges. Then I repeated that whole process with the other half of that sheet of vinyl. When that sheet of vinyl was adhered and trimmed, then I moved on to the next piece until I had the entire floor covered. So there was only one piece of baseboard in this room, and that was directly in front of the large cabinet. So to stay on budget, I purchased 5 pieces of polystyrene quarter-round molding, which cost me just a little over $20. I nailed it in place and filled in the top and bottom edges with white caulk. This small expense was well worth it because the quarter round made both the floor and the walls look so much better. While I was working on the basement, I found an old desk cabinet on the curb. I threw it in the back of my car because I knew it would provide needed extra storage. Because I was going to be putting this behind the door that leads into the family room, I decided to take the doors off the cabinet so it would be easier for my son to take things in and out. I painted the outside of the cabinet with a little bit of black paint that I had left over from the living room bedroom makeover. Then I used some peel and stick wallpaper that I had left over from that same green bookcase in a previous video. This room has no natural light, and when I tried adding a shade to the one ceiling fixture, the room was quite dark. So I covered the bulbs with these industrial shades that I found in my own personal stash. I had bought them a few years ago for a bathroom remodel and didn't end up using them. I decided to paint just the front trim of the bookshelves with the green paint, and so I needed to give the wood a good cleaning. I rubbed it down with boiled linseed oil and used some very fine steel wool in conjunction with the oil to rub off stains and paint splatters. I purchased this West Elm jute rug at the Habitat for Humanity Restore for just $10. Because my vinyl floor had several seams, I wanted to protect them with a rug. I used a little carpet tape to hold the rug in place so it wouldn't catch on the door. The wall plates in the room were old and mismatched. I had 2 silver light switch plates that I wasn't using anymore, and I purchased an outlet plate to match. So I was not able to stay within my $100 budget, but I would have been really close had I not purchased a new roll of peel and stick wallpaper. What do you think? Was this makeover worth $136.25? Well, I have to be honest, this kitchen makeover was a lot of work, but I'm pretty pleased with how it turned out, and I sure hope you found it helpful in some small way. I'd love to know which of today's projects you enjoyed the most. And if you'd like to see how I made over the upstairs kitchen and living room in this same home, I'll be sure to link them in the closing slide. Well, that's all for today. Thank you so very much for watching, and I hope to see you next week. Bye-bye for now.